The ballroom of the Meridian Grand smelled like champagne and cedar smoke, and under the chandeliers, 300 of the aerospace industry's most powerful people were laughing at jokes they didn't find funny, because laughing was part of the deal-making. Jake Sullivan stood near the back wall in a jacket that had been pressed twice by his own hand that morning, holding a glass of water he hadn't touched, when the first hand landed on his shoulder. It wasn't gentle. 2 security guards in black suits flanked him before he could finish turning around, and the room, without seeming to look, looked. A tray of glasses tipped on a nearby table as one of the guards nudged him toward the exit, and 3 flutes of champagne shattered against the marble, the sound cutting cleanly through the string quartet. Victoria Brooks, CEO of Halbrand Dynamics, stood 20 feet away in a deep red gown, her jaw set, one hand raised slightly as if she'd just given a command she already regretted the shape of. "He's not on the list," she said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, cold enough that nobody questioned her. Jake didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her for one long second, not with anger, but with something quieter and heavier, and let the guards walk him out into the cold. To find out how a single dad in a $50 jacket ended up costing Victoria Brooks the biggest contract of her career, stay until the very end. If stories like this speak to you, the quiet ones who get underestimated before anyone bothers to ask who they really are, we'd love to know you're out there. So leave a comment and let us know you're watching. And here's the part that might get some of you talking before we even get going. Was Victoria wrong to trust her own eyes that night? Or was she just protecting a room full of people who'd paid a fortune to be there? You decide. 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Not the Gala, not the 2 companies about to collide. Not even the version of Jake Sullivan who wore a maintenance badge instead of an engineer's clearance. 3 years earlier, Jake Sullivan had been the lead propulsion systems engineer at Aerotech Solutions, a name that used to mean something in defense contracting circles. Back when the company still had contracts to speak of, he had built his career on precision, micron-level tolerances, thermal load calculations that other engineers double-checked and always found correct, a design philosophy that treated every gram of unnecessary weight as a personal insult. He'd led the propulsion team on the Kestrel 7 prototype, a next-generation interceptor drone system that Aerotech had bet the company on. And for 11 months, Jake had barely slept because Mia, his daughter 6 years old at the time, had just lost her mother to a car accident on a rain-slicked overpass, and grief and work had become the only 2 rooms Jake knew how to live in. The Kestrel 7 failed catastrophically during a live-fire test 18 months before the Gala, and the failure cost Aerotech an $800 million contract renewal, and, within the year, its existence as an independent company. The internal investigation blamed a propulsion coupling failure. It blamed Jake. What it did not mention, what only 3 people in that boardroom ever knew, and what none of them said aloud, was that the coupling specification had been altered 11 days before the test, in a change order signed off by someone above Jake's authority, someone who needed the timeline moved up to satisfy a board that wanted good news before the fiscal year closed. Jake had flagged the change in writing. The email existed. It was buried, quietly, the way inconvenient emails get buried when the person who buried them has more to lose than the person underneath them. Jake didn't fight it. He had a 6-year-old at home who had already lost one parent to the news arriving suddenly, and Jake could not risk a multi-year legal battle against a company with unlimited lawyers, while Mia needed someone steady at the breakfast table every single morning. He took the severance, signed the non-disparagement agreement, and disappeared from an industry that talks in whispers about people who used to be somebody. He became, over the following 2 years, a maintenance technician for a commercial building services company. The kind of job where nobody asks about your master's degree, where you fix elevators and HVAC systems and nobody expects you to say anything at all, which suited him fine, because everything he had left to say, he said to Mia, at night, in the small rented house they now called home. Victoria Brooks, meanwhile, had spent those same 3 years clawing Halbrand Dynamics up from the number 4 defense contractor in the region to a serious contender for the largest interceptor systems contract the Department of Defense had put out to bid in a decade, a contract worth $1.2 billion, one that would define whether Halbrand remained a private company or got swallowed by a larger competitor within 18 months. Victoria had inherited the company from her father at 31 and had spent a decade proving to a board of men twice her age that she deserved the chair she sat in, which meant she had learned, early and permanently, to trust systems over instincts, credentials over impressions, and polish over substance, because polish, in her experience, was what the board could see. The man responsible for closing that $1.2 billion deal on paper was Halbrandt's chief technology officer, Marcus Reyes, a sharp, magnetic executive who had joined Halbrandt from Aerotech 18 months after its collapse, bringing with him a portfolio of his propulsion innovations that had, in fact, been substantially built on architecture Jake had designed years earlier and never gotten credit for. Marcus was smooth in board meetings, fluent in the specific vocabulary that made investors nod, and utterly convincing in every room he entered. Which was exactly why nobody at Halbrandt had ever thought to ask why the breakthrough propulsion design he'd presented 18 months into. His tenure looked, to anyone who'd actually worked the original Kestrel 7 program, suspiciously familiar. The gala that night was meant to be a formality, a celebratory dinner 2 days before Halbrandt's final technical presentation to the Department of Defense Selection Committee, a room full of donors, subcontractors, and government liaisons who needed to feel, in their bones, that Halbrandt was already the winner. Victoria had walked that ballroom for 3 hours, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments, carrying the entire weight of the company's future in her spine, when she noticed a man standing quietly near the back wall. Plain jacket, no name badge, no drink in his hand, and something in her, tired and wound tight and terrified of anything going wrong 2 days before the biggest presentation of her career, decided he did not belong there. She would spend the rest of her life understanding exactly how wrong that decision was. 8 months would pass before that particular kind of wrongness would fully reveal itself to her. But the unraveling started that very night, in a hallway she never saw, with a phone call she wasn't on. The invitation Jake had been holding in his coat pocket, the one nobody asked to see, had come from Elena Choi, a former Aerotech propulsion analyst who now worked in Halbrandt's engineering division, one of the very few people who had never stopped believing the official story about the Kestrel 7 failure was incomplete. Elena had invited Jake quietly, off the books, hoping to introduce him to a few people in the industry who might remember his real work rather than the version that had been written into his exit paperwork. She'd been pulled into an urgent conversation with a supplier the moment Jake arrived, and by the time she looked up, the guards already had him by the arm. Jake didn't explain who he was. That was the detail that would haunt Victoria later more than almost anything else. That he'd had, in his coat pocket, an invitation with his name printed on it, and he never once reached for it. Never raised his voice, never said, "You're making a mistake." He simply let them walk him to the door, past tables of people who glanced away rather than watch, past a coat check attendant who quietly, without being asked, handed him his coat and murmured that she was sorry. Outside, in the cold, Jake stood on the curb for a moment, put his hands in his pockets, and walked 6 blocks to catch the last bus home, because street parking near the Meridian Grand ran $40 an hour. And Jake did the math on things like that automatically now, the way some men do math on golf handicaps. He didn't tell Mia what happened. When he got home, she was already asleep on the couch with her homework half finished beside her, and he carried her to bed the way he always did, brushing her hair back from her forehead, and told the empty kitchen, quietly, that it didn't matter, that it had never mattered, that the only thing that mattered was that she woke up tomorrow with cereal in the cupboard and a dad who showed up. He believed it when he said it, mostly. 2 days later, in a conference room 40 floors above the city, Victoria Brooks sat at the head of the table as the Department of Defense Selection Committee delivered its verdict on the $1.2 billion interceptor contract. Halbrandt had lost, not to a rival's superior bid, but to a disqualification. During final technical vetting, a DoD compliance auditor had cross-referenced the patent architecture behind Halbrandt's winning propulsion coupling design against a sealed engineering archive from the Kestrel 7 program, flagged 3 years earlier in an unrelated federal review of Aerotech's collapse. The coupling design Marcus Reyes had presented as Halbrandt's core innovation was, structurally and in several places verbatim, the design Jake Sullivan had authored and been blamed for. The government's conclusion was not that Halbrand had stolen the design outright. The truth was messier and worse. A slow contamination of half-credited ideas passed through a man who'd never disclosed where his innovations originated. But the disqualification was immediate and absolute. No active federal contract could be built on intellectual property with a disputed and unresolved origin. Halbrand lost the largest deal in its history in the span of a 14-minute phone call. And Victoria Brooks sat in that conference room and felt, for the first time in a decade, the specific vertigo of watching everything she'd built come apart because of a decision that hadn't been hers to make, and one that had been hers to make 2 nights earlier, at her own gala. It took her research team 6 hours to identify the name behind the original Kestrel 7 patent filings, Jacob R. Sullivan. It took Victoria 4 seconds to remember exactly who that was, and where she had last seen him. On a curb outside her own event, in a jacket she'd judged in under 2 seconds, being walked out by 2 men in suits she had personally hired. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her office long after the building had emptied, going through the internal investigation file from Aerotech's collapse that her legal team had pulled, the version that had been made public, and then, because something about the timeline nagged at her, the raw internal communications her team managed to obtain through a contact at Aerotech's former parent company. Buried 9 pages into a change order thread was a single email from Jake Sullivan, timestamped 11 days before the failed test, flagging the coupling specification change as a deviation outside approved thermal tolerances and requesting a formal review before implementation. The request had been denied by a project director 2 levels above Jake in a 1-line reply. Timeline holds. Proceed as directed. That project director's name, Victoria already knew because he'd sat across from her in board meetings for the past 18 months, presenting himself as the architect of Halbrand's entire propulsion advantage. Victoria sat with that email for a long time. She thought about the sound of champagne glasses shattering on marble. She thought about the way the man at the back wall hadn't argued, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything except let it happen to him. The way people do when they've been let down by systems so many times that fighting no longer feels like an option worth exhausting. She thought about her own reflection in the dark window of her office, 40 floors up, and did not like what she saw there. Somewhere in the city below her, a maintenance technician was walking to a bus stop, going home to make his daughter breakfast, having no idea that the woman who'd had him thrown out of a party 2 nights earlier was about to spend everything she had trying to find him. 6 weeks would pass before Victoria worked up the courage to actually knock on his door. 6 weeks in which the full cost of what she'd lost and what she'd cost him 3 years before that would come into focus one unbearable piece at a time. If any of you watching have ever been the one dismissed at a glance, sized up by your clothes, your job, your quiet, before anyone bothered to ask who you actually were, we'd love to hear it in the comments, because so many of you watching have lived exactly this. The 6 weeks that followed were the quietest kind of unraveling, the kind that happens mostly in private, in the space between a person's public composure and what they actually know. Victoria did not go to the press. She did not fire Marcus Reyes immediately, though she began, carefully and without his knowledge, having her general counsel trace every patent filing and design document he'd submitted since joining Halbrand, cross-referencing timestamps against the sealed Aerotech archive the DoD auditor had flagged. What she found unsettled her more each day. Not a single dramatic theft, but a pattern of small deniable borrowings, a coupling geometry here, a thermal load approach there, each one plausible on its own, each one, together, unmistakably built on architecture that belonged to someone else. It was Elena Choi, the analyst who had invited Jake to the gala in the first place, and who had spent 3 sleepless days after the disqualification debating whether to say anything at all, afraid of what it might cost her, who finally walked into Victoria's office unannounced and told her everything. Who Jake really was, what he'd actually built at Aerotech, what he'd flagged and been overruled on, and what it had cost him to stay silent about all of it for 3 years. Because a wrongful termination fight against a well-lawyered company wasn't a fight a single father grieving his wife could afford to have. Elena's voice shook through most of it. She said she should have said something the moment Marcus started presenting propulsion concepts that felt oddly, specifically familiar. Victoria listened without interrupting, and when Elena finished, Victoria thanked her, quietly, and meant it, and then asked her for one thing: Jake's address. She almost didn't go. She sat in her car outside a small rented house in a neighborhood she'd never had reason to drive through, engine off, hands on the wheel, running through the words for 20 minutes before she made herself get out. Jake answered the door in a t-shirt with a dish towel over his shoulder. Mia's homework spread across the kitchen table behind him, and when he saw who was standing on his porch, something in his face closed, not with anger exactly, but with the specific fatigue of a man who has learned that powerful people showing up at his door rarely means anything good. The conversation, when it finally happened, was not warm. Victoria offered, in the first 5 minutes, the things she assumed a man in his position would want: a formal public apology, a consulting contract at a rate she named without blinking, a settlement figure meant to close the matter cleanly. Jake listened to all of it standing in his own doorway, arms crossed, and then said, in the same quiet register he'd used the night of the gala, that he didn't want her money, and he didn't want a title. What he wanted, he said, was for the report that blamed him for the Kestrel 7 failure to be corrected. Not quietly, not in a settlement with a confidentiality clause, but on the record, so that any engineer who ever searched his name for a future job wouldn't find a lie sitting at the top of the results. And he wanted to know that the next time someone underneath a bad decision flagged it in writing, somebody with power would actually read it before the deadline instead of after the disaster. Victoria stood on that porch and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, didn't have a prepared answer. She came back 3 days later, this time without an offer, and asked instead if she could see the original Kestrel 7 design files, the ones Jake still had. Legally, carefully. Kept on an encrypted personal drive for 3 years, not as leverage, but because deleting them had felt, to him, like agreeing to a story he knew wasn't true. Reviewing them together at his kitchen table, while Mia did homework at the other end, and occasionally asked pointed 9-year-old questions about why the propulsion lady was in their kitchen, Victoria began to understand the scope of what Jake had actually built. Not just a defensible design, but an elegant one, years ahead of what Marcus had presented as cutting edge. It was the first time in months Jake had talked about his work out loud to someone who understood it. And something in him that had gone quiet for 3 years started, cautiously, speaking again. The secondary crisis arrived 9 days after that, when Marcus Reyes, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, moved first. He leaked to 2 industry trade publications that Halbrandt's disqualification had been the result of a rogue former employee's doctored files, framing Jake as a bitter ex-engineer trying to extort the company that had generously tried to make amends. The story spread fast in the narrow, gossip-hungry world of defense contracting, and for 3 days Jake's name, a name he'd spent 3 years trying to keep quiet, was suddenly attached to accusations of fraud in industry newsletters that mattered to exactly the kind of people who might someday hire him. Victoria watched it happen and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that fixing this the safe way, quietly, behind closed doors, protecting Halbrandt's reputation above all else, was no longer a road that led anywhere but deeper into the same failure that had already cost her $1.2 billion and, she was starting to realize, a great deal more than that. Some fights, she was beginning to understand, older employees who'd spent decades in this industry could see coming a mile off, while people trained on spreadsheets and quarterly targets never saw at all. A difference in judgment that had nothing to do with degrees on a wall. 2 months would pass before Victoria found the one piece of evidence solid enough to end Marcus Reyes's leaking for good. And when she found it, it wouldn't come from a lawyer or an auditor, but from Jake himself in the last place she expected to look. The evidence, when it surfaced, came from an unglamorous place. A backup server Aerotech's former IT contractor had never fully wiped before the company's assets were liquidated, which Elena tracked down through a contact who'd kept a personal archive as a hedge against exactly this kind of dispute. Buried in a folder of unremarkable engineering logs was a metadata trail showing the exact date Marcus Reyes had accessed Jake's original Kestrel 7 design files during his final month at Aerotech, 3 weeks before the company's collapse, and 11 months before he ever presented a single original concept to Hal Brent's board. It wasn't circumstantial. It was a timestamp, a file signature, and an access log that placed Marcus's fingerprints on Jake's work with a precision no PR spin could survive. Victoria called an emergency board meeting the following morning, and rather than handling the confrontation with Marcus privately, the way every instinct she'd built over a decade told her to, protecting the company's image above all else, she made a decision that cost her sleep the night before. She asked Jake to be in the room, not to testify formally, not yet, but to sit at the table as the person whose work was actually being discussed. For once, instead of being discussed about him behind closed doors. Jake almost said no. He told her, standing in his kitchen the night before, that rooms like that had never once gone well for him, and that he wasn't interested in becoming a spectacle for people who'd ignored him for 3 years. Victoria didn't argue him out of it. She simply said that if he came, he would not be walked out by anyone this time, that she would make sure of that personally, and that whatever happened in that room, it would happen with his voice in it, not around it. Something in the way she said it, flat, exhausted, entirely without performance, was different enough from the woman at the gala that Jake, after a long silence, agreed. In the boardroom the next morning, with the access logs projected on the screen behind him, Marcus Reyes did what cornered, charming men do first. He minimized. He called it convergent engineering, insisted that propulsion coupling geometry within certain physical constraints inevitably resembled itself across different teams, used the specific fluent corporate language that had carried him through a decade of rooms exactly like this one. It worked for about 90 seconds on 2 of the older board members who wanted, badly, for this to be a misunderstanding rather than a scandal. Then Jake spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, in the same even voice he'd used on the curb outside the gala, and walked the room through the actual thermal tolerance calculations behind the coupling design, the specific material stress limits at play, the exact reasoning behind a bracket angle that Marcus's original version had copied down to a decimal point that had no engineering justification except that it had been copied. He did it without notes. He did it the way a man does something he has done 10,000 times before, quietly, precisely, without needing anyone in the room to be impressed, though every person in it was. It was Marcus's own reaction that finished him, not the data on the screen, but the visible panic that crossed his face when he realized the room had stopped looking at Jake and started looking at him, and that the 2 younger board members who'd built their entire confidence in Hal Brent's technical advantage around his presentations were now doing math in their heads about every claim he'd ever made to them. He left the meeting before it formally ended, citing a call he needed to take, and never came back to the building. His resignation letter arrived by email that evening, worded carefully to avoid admitting anything actionable, which fooled absolutely no one in that boardroom. But the reveal wasn't only about Marcus. Sitting at that table, several board members, people who had shaken Jake's hand 100 times at industry functions over the years without ever really seeing him, back when he'd been somebody at Aerotech, began slowly to reconstruct in real time exactly who had been standing at the back wall of Victoria's gala 2 months earlier. One of them, a woman named Diane Holt, who'd sat on Aerotech's technical advisory board before its collapse, went visibly pale and admitted, in front of everyone, that she remembered the original change order dispute, that she'd heard rumors at the time that someone had flagged the coupling deviation and been overruled, and that she'd never once thought to ask what had happened to that person. She looked at Jake across the table and said she was sorry, and meant it in the specific, aching way people mean things they should have said 3 years earlier. Victoria didn't perform contrition in that meeting. She simply, once Marcus's resignation was confirmed, turned to the board and said that Hal Brent would be issuing a full, on-the-record correction to the Kestrel 7 investigation record, reinstating Jake Sullivan's name as the design lead responsible for the propulsion architecture at the center of it, and that she would be personally overseeing it. 2 board members objected, worried about the liability exposure of admitting Aerotech's, and by extension Marcus's, and by further extension, Hal Brent's, role in the original cover-up. Victoria didn't raise her voice. She simply said that Halbrand had already lost $1.2 billion trying to build a future on a foundation of someone else's stolen work, and that she would rather lose the rest of the board's confidence than do that twice. The room went quiet. Nobody objected again. Outside, after the meeting, Jake stood in the hallway with his coat over his arm. A different hallway than the one he'd been walked through 2 months earlier, one floor up, but close enough that the symmetry wasn't lost on either of them. And Victoria walked out to find him there, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Then she asked him, quietly, if he'd consider coming back into the industry. Not as a favor, not as an apology dressed up as a job offer, but because Halbrand genuinely needed the kind of engineering judgment that had been missing from its propulsion program for 3 years, and she didn't know anyone better qualified to lead it. Jake didn't answer right away. He told her he'd need to think about what it would mean for Mia, for the stability she finally had, for the quiet life he'd built around protecting her from exactly this kind of public unraveling. 1 month would pass before he gave Victoria his answer, and, in that month, something neither of them had planned for began quietly taking shape between them. In the ordinary, unglamorous hours of a project neither of them expected to change quite so much. Jake said yes, eventually, but not to the title Victoria first offered him. He turned down the Chief Technology Officer position, the showy, public reinstatement that would have made headlines, that would have looked, from the outside, like the perfect tidy ending to an ugly story, and asked instead for something smaller and, to him, more important. A working propulsions design lead role, hands directly on the engineering, with one condition attached that he insisted on before signing anything. He wanted Halbrand to establish a formal internal review channel where any engineer, at any level, could flag a safety or design concern directly to an independent technical board, not a project director, not someone whose deadline the concern might inconvenience, and have that flag documented and addressed within a fixed number of days. No exceptions, no burying it 9 pages into a thread. Victoria didn't just agree to it. She sat with him and Elena for 2 full days building the actual policy, because she had learned by then that the difference between an apology and a correction is whether anything changes structurally afterward. The formal correction to the Kestrel 7 investigation record was published 4 months after the Gala, alongside a joint statement from Halbrand and the Department of Defense acknowledging the origin of the propulsion architecture and outlining a path for Halbrand to resubmit a compliant bid for a modified version of the Interceptor contract, smaller now, restructured but real, built this time on a foundation nobody could dispute. When the news broke, a handful of the people who had watched Jake get walked out of the Gala 6 months earlier sent him messages of congratulations he mostly didn't answer, not out of bitterness, but because he'd never needed the applause. He'd only ever needed the record corrected, and it was. The working relationship between Jake and Victoria over those months had none of the sharp edges of their first 2 conversations. It became, instead, something built out of long hours at whiteboards, out of Victoria staying late, not because the board demanded it, but because she wanted to understand the engineering herself, instead of just trusting someone else's summary of it, out of small, unremarkable Tuesday evenings when Jake would mention, almost as an aside, that Mia had a school project due and he needed to leave by 6, and Victoria, who had built her entire adult identity around never leaving anything by 6, found herself, more than once, offering to help Mia with a diorama of the solar system at Jake's kitchen table, instead of going home to an empty apartment. Mia, for her part, decided within about 3 weeks that Victoria was actually pretty cool for a CEO, a review she delivered with the total, unqualified authority of a 9-year-old, and one that mattered to both adults more than either of them expected it to. It was Mia, in fact, who said the thing that neither Jake nor Victoria had worked up the nerve to say to each other, one evening about 7 months after the Gala, looking up from her homework to ask Victoria, with no warning at all, whether she was going to be around a lot, because she kind of hoped so. Victoria, who had negotiated 8-figure contracts without flinching, did not have a ready answer for a 9-year-old's question, and Jake, standing at the stove with his back to both of them, went very still for a moment before turning around. What happened next unfolded slowly, the way real things tend to, rather than the way the Gala night had. No dramatic scene, no shattered glass, Just two people who had been humbled by the same year in different ways, choosing, quietly and deliberately, to keep choosing each other. They were married the following spring, in a small backyard ceremony with folding chairs and a cake Mia insisted on helping decorate. Nothing like the ballroom of the Meridian Grand, and that was, both of them agreed, entirely the point. Victoria wore flats. Jake wore the same jacket he'd worn to the gala, pressed once more, on purpose, and when Victoria noticed it during the ceremony, she reached over and took his hand and didn't let go for the rest of the night. A year after the gala, Jake kept one small thing on the corner of his desk at Halbrand. Not an award, not a plaque, but the water glass he'd been holding the night security walked him out. The one he'd carried untouched through 3 hours of a party he never should have had to justify his presence at. He never explained it to anyone who asked, except once, to Mia, who wanted to know why her dad kept an old cup on his desk. He told her it was there to remind him that the people who see you clearly aren't always the first ones in the room. And that's all right, because the ones who finally do see you are usually worth the wait. If there's someone in your own life who's ever been judged the way Jake was that night, sized up by a jacket, a job title, a quiet way of standing at the back of a room, and written off before anyone bothered to ask who they really were, we'd love for you to tell us about them in the comments, even if it's just to finally give them, here, the credit they never got at the time. And if you believe the quiet, overlooked people in your own life deserve to be truly seen the way Jake finally was, consider staying with us and subscribing, because we've got more stories like this one waiting, and we'd love to have you here for the next one. Thank you for staying until the end. This one, we think, earned it.